Greetings, everyone. Mr. Kuespert here to talk to you a little bit today about how protests in the colonies eventually led to rebellion. Now, up to this point, we've seen the colonists resistant of many British acts, and the British have, in a way of trying to, in some cases, trying to get the colonists to pay for the French and Indian War that was fought in North America. They've been imposing taxes on the colonists against their will, and the colonists really have no way of stopping it. The colonists did not elect those officials, and many of the colonists are using phrases like taxation without representation, meaning that the government and the king were not put into power by the colonists. So the colonists are resisting, saying, since you weren't elected by us, you have no authority over us to impose taxes. So many of these colonists have resisted and protested, boycotted many of these acts, and the British government, instead of looking strong, they've actually come across looking very weak by repealing these taxes or changing or altering these taxes because of the protests. And one of the main ones that comes across at this point is the Tea Act. Now, the Townshend Acts were passed. A series of acts were passed by the British government to impose taxes on the colonists in many different things, including things like paint, pitch, tar, turpentine, things like that. And what happened is one of the acts was on tea. And when the Townshend Acts were repealed, I should say, the Tea Act stayed on. Now, the Tea Act actually was a lowering of the tax on tea. However, one part of the Tea Act that colonists really resented was the fact that it gave complete 100% control of the tea industry and sales in America to the East India Company. And the East India Company was a company that basically would give all of the profits or all of the taxes right back to Britain, and eliminated any kind of market from the French or the Dutch in America for tea. And so this meant that every single purchase of tea in the colonies from that point forward would be a tax that would go into the pocket of Parliament and the King. And this was just yet another strike against the Parliament that many of the colonists resented. And at this point, they are pretty much willing to not pay a single dime, a single penny of any tax of any kind. And they are really fighting back and resisting in any way, shape, or form. And so far, many things have worked. And now some of the colonists believe it's time to start ramping up the efforts. If you recall previously, we discussed something called the Committees of Correspondence. Now, this was a group or several groups of people that helped to spread information throughout the colonies via word of mouth. Instead of paying for newspapers, in which then in turn you'd have to pay for the stamp, that royal stamp, and that tax for the purpose of getting that stamp on your newspaper to show you paid it. People avoided paying the tax by just spreading information word of mouth. Well, one particular committee of correspondence that decided to ramp up their efforts was called the Sons of Liberty. This was many of them obviously operating in secret away from the British authorities, and many of them were very high upstanding citizens in the British community. People like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere and the like. And many of these men were organizing ways of protest. And one protest, the most interesting form of protest, came in the form of what was known as the Boston Tea Party. Now, this was essentially an effort by the Sons of Liberty to stop the delivery of tea onto the shores of Boston Harbor, and that tea would then have been distributed throughout the colonies. And, the Sons of Liberty did not want to have that tea forced upon them, and they certainly did not want to have to pay the tax for that tea. And so they organized on the night of December 16th in 1773, and they stormed a ship in Boston Harbor, They boarded the ship, and in a few hours, they had dumped all of their cargo of tea into the sea. They busted open each case, and they ripped open the bags, and they spilled the tea into the harbor, and made certainly probably the most caffeinated fish that had ever been around at that point. But they had basically destroyed about 90,000 pounds of tea. Now, the thing is that the British authorities weren't really sure exactly who to prosecute at that point, because the authorities were perplexed. The people who had boarded the ship were dressed as Native Americans. Now, they weren't really trying to prove that they were Native American. They were just trying to disguise themselves so that the authorities couldn't exactly make out who each of them were. That was more the point, because I think it was pretty obvious to everyone that they were not Native Americans. But the protest was very effective and certainly rallied many colonists into more and more action, and things became even more tense, and things escalated even more within the colonies, in specific the New England colonies at this point. Now, the protests had really drawn the ire of the king. The king felt at this point that the Parliament had not done its job, that Parliament was really making England look really weak, and that the colonists were behaving like pretty much spoiled brat children, and that he was going to need to be personally involved in getting Parliament to make really harsh measures, firm measures, to make the colonists pay for their bad behavior. The Intolerable Acts were the result of this. Now, that's what the colonists referred to them as. They were actually known as the Coercive Acts. Coercive meaning that they were trying to coerce or trying to force the colonists to act properly and obey the law. Colonists called them intolerable because they thought that they were so horrible, and that these punishments were really too firm. These acts closed the ports of Boston, took the power away from the elected legislature and gave it to the king-appointed governor, and also really reinforced and pushed even further the Quartering Act, which again allowed soldiers to stay in, that is, British soldiers to stay in colonists' homes against their will. Another act that was passed was called the Quebec Act, and really this one was to spite the colonists. Remember, after the French and Indian War, the British had taken control of the Ohio River Valley. That was the whole point of the war, for the most part, in North America, and they took that control of the area away from the French. Well, the British basically said, we're going to re-allow the French colonists to move back into the Ohio River Valley, and colonists are not allowed to move out there. So obviously that was made to completely spite the colonists and get them angry. And it was at this point that the colonists decided, enough's enough on our end. We need to start taking more drastic measures here to start to reinforce our rights as Englishmen and try to get the king to understand our side, and say that that Parliament has really overstepped its bounds. So this group that was going to form would be known as the First Continental Congress, and the First Continental Congress would meet in Philadelphia in September and October of 1774. They would have representatives from almost all of the colonies, and that they would sit down and meet and talk, and they would try to put out a letter to the king asking him to tell Parliament to call off the dogs. And they were going to ask for the repealing of these intolerable acts, and ask that the colonists had the right to govern themselves and tax themselves, and that Parliament needed to lay off. Now, one thing that the First Continental Congress did in addition was to create militia, or urge colonists to create militia groups to defend against the Redcoats' impending invasion should the British Parliament and King reject their request for repealing of the taxes and acts that were so horrible against them from what they believed. Well, the British government pretty much ignored any demands that they had, and they indeed began to send redcoats by the hundreds by boat to America. Well, one particular incident took place in April of 1775, and that is when one particular group called the Minutemen had broken into an arsenal, a storage house for weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, and which was about 20 miles northwest of Boston. And the redcoats decided they needed to get those arms back and force those colonists to retreat, and they were going to go and arrest them. Well, they were getting ready to march, and in the middle of this, or during this time when they were getting ready to march, some spies had found out that these troops were going to be marching on to Concord the next day, and so they needed to get the word out to the Minutemen to get their arms and turn out the militia along the road and fight against these redcoats as they were heading toward Concord. Well, they didn't know exactly which route these soldiers would go, these redcoats. They were either going to go along the neck, which means that they were going to travel south from Boston, since Boston was a peninsula at that time, and they were going to go around the southern edge of the town and then to the northwest from there, or they were going to load onto boats by sea, and they were going to go across the Charles River and then land the boat, and then they were going to unload the troops and go that direction, which was a little further north. So it was either going to be by land or by sea. They didn't know which. So there was a signal that was going to be placed in the Old North Church. It was going to be one lantern if it was confirmed that the troops were going to go by land, and two lanterns if it was confirmed that the troops were going to go by sea. Two lanterns were put in the church steeple, and it was realized at that point that Paul Revere and William Dawes needed to go on the famous ride to warn the Minutemen to be prepared that the redcoats were coming within a few hours. Indeed, they were. Now, before the redcoats advanced to Concord, about 5 miles back to the east, there were several Minutemen waiting for the redcoats at Lexington, and they stood their ground, and they would not move when the redcoats got there. And basically something happened where we're not exactly sure, but a shot was fired. Neither side really knew where it came from. In fact, some historians believe it was someone off to the side who might have been completely unrelated to the fighting, who might have been doing some hunting nearby. And but either way, this caused the first shots to be fired. In fact, many historians refer to it as the shot heard round the world that started the American Revolution. The British and eventually killed 8 of the colonists at Lexington before they retreated. Well, they retreated for just a short time until they met a much larger force at Concord, and this really threw the British off. They did not expect there to be that many Americans there, and at that point, the British were forced to retreat at the Battle of Concord, and they had to make their way all the way back to Boston, and the entire way back, the colonists used hit-and-run tactics, like ambush-type warfare, guerrilla warfare, to keep the British on their toes. The British, who always liked to fight in rows and columns, were completely taken aback by the fact that these colonists liked to fight in groups of 6 to 8 people, hiding behind trees, shooting and then running away. The British called this a very cowardly way of fighting, but the Americans called it a very effective way of fighting. And at this point, you can see the American Revolution is now going to be in full swing.